The prevailing architecture of the fifth generation of K-pop was built on a foundation of hyper-reality, a landscape where the currency of the realm was spectacle, AI-enhanced precision, and a relentless pursuit of the viral moment. In this ecosystem, the idol is often positioned as an untouchable deity, a flawless construct designed for global consumption. It is within this rigid framework that the emergence of BoyNextDoor must be analyzed, not as a serendipitous accident or a charming underdog story, but as a structural correction. When the 6 members of BoyNextDoor entered the scene, they did not attempt to outshout the titans of the industry. They simply rendered the competition's volume irrelevant. By eschewing the industry standard of high-budget mystique or a strategy of calculated approachability, they exposed a critical fatigue in the consumer base. This was not a gamble on a niche concept. It was a precise identification of a market vacuum where the audience was starving for authenticity amidst a feast of manufactured perfection. The group's ascent was inevitable because they were the only ones willing to dismantle the fourth wall that the rest of the industry was desperately trying to polish. The early positioning of BoyNextDoor within KOZ Entertainment is frequently misinterpreted as a marginalization phase, a narrative that suggests they were sidelined by the dominance of the established Big Four agencies. However, a rigorous analysis reveals that this perceived distance from the industry's epicenter was a strategic insulation, not a disadvantage. Zico's founding of KOZ Entertainment in 2019 was an exercise in structural subversion, creating a home for artists who existed in the negative space of the traditional idol mold. By operating outside the conglomerate machinery, BoyNextDoor was afforded a rare commodity in the modern landscape, the freedom to be unpolished. While their contemporaries were being polished into flawless avatars of perfection, BoyNextDoor was allowed to retain the jagged edges of youth. This was not a lack of resources. It was a deliberate curation of emotional realism. The industry's dismissal of rookies from a smaller label provided the perfect cover for the group to cultivate a distinct sonic and visual identity without the suffocating weight of immediate global expectations. They were not being ignored. They were being incubated. This incubation period was defined by a pressure that served not as a hindrance, but as a necessary qualification for their later authority. In an industry where the margin for error is non-existent, BoyNextDoor's debut strategy was a high-wire act of confidence. The decision to launch with a triple title track strategy, But I Like You, One and Only, and Serenade, was a rejection of the conventional wisdom that dictates rookies must play it safe to secure a foothold. This was a move typically reserved for established acts with built-in safety nets, yet BoyNextDoor utilized it to force the market to engage with them on their own terms. The pressure to deliver 3 distinct narratives simultaneously did not crush them. It legitimized their claim to artistry. They were not asking for attention. They were demanding an evaluation of their depth. The critical reception that labeled them relatable or approachable was a surface-level reading of a much deeper dynamic. They had successfully weaponized vulnerability. By presenting a complete emotional spectrum of teenage love immediately, they bypassed the typical developmental years of idol growth and stepped directly into the role of narrators for their generation. The industry constraints that should have limited their expansion, the lack of a massive corporate infrastructure, the saturation of the boy group market, and the rigid expectations of fifth-generation concepts actually served as the catalysts for their specific brand of strategic patience. While the market chased the transient highs of viral choreography and conceptual grandeur, BoyNextDoor engaged in a long game of narrative accumulation. The first Love Trilogy, spanning from Who to Why and concluding with How, was not merely a series of releases. It was a serialized documentary set to music. This structure forced the audience to invest in a timeline, to wait for the next chapter, creating a retention mechanism that viral hits cannot replicate. The constraints of their brand, the limitation of being the boys next door, meant they could not rely on shock value or radical reinvention. This forced them to drill deeper rather than wider, mining the nuances of growing up until the specificity of their experience became universal. The industry standard of constant reinvention was replaced by a model of linear progression, where every release added a layer to the foundation rather than replacing it. This accumulation of leverage inevitably led to a breakpoint where the system could no longer contain their trajectory, a moment that arrived not by chance but through precise calibration. The release of 1999 in September 2024 was the culmination of a narrative arc that the industry had initially underestimated. As the members stood on the precipice of adulthood, the EP served as a thesis statement for their career. The anxieties of youth were not a phase to be outgrown, but the very core of their artistic identity. The timing was dictated by the natural maturation of the group, and the market's readiness for a sound that bridged the gap between adolescent innocence and adult introspection. The simultaneous success of their Japanese debut and the knock-on Volder 1 tour was not a separate victory. It was the inevitable overflow of a demand that had been building since their debut. The industry infrastructure, which often acts as a gatekeeper, could not suppress a movement that had already decentralized itself into the lives of its audience. The breakpoint occurred when the Boys Next Door became the standard bearers, shifting the center of gravity in the fifth generation from the spectacular to the sincere. The accolades that followed, the topping of the Circle album chart, the entry into the Billboard 200, and the multiple number ones on the Oricon charts, were merely confirmations of an argument that had already been won in the cultural consciousness. These numbers serve as receipts for a transaction that took place long before the charts were tallied, the exchange of artificial perfection for genuine connection. The statistical success of BoyNextDoor does not prove that they made it. It proves that the industry's previous metrics for success were incomplete. When Woonha commanded the stage as an MC or when Taeson's lyrics resonated with literary weight, they were not demonstrating potential. They were displaying authority. The numbers are not the destination. They are the shadow cast by the size of their influence. They confirm that in a landscape of calculated illusions, the most valuable asset is truth. The final analysis of BoyNextDoor's trajectory reveals that their success did not disrupt the larger structure of K-pop. It expanded the definition of what the structure can support. They proved that the idol does not have to be an untouchable fantasy to be commercially viable, thereby opening a lane for future acts to prioritize artistic sincerity over industrial polish. This outcome represents strategic excellence because it required the discipline to resist the easy allure of the viral cycle and the foresight to build a legacy on the unsteady ground of adolescence. They did not succeed despite the industry's constraints. They succeeded because they understood that the constraints were the very thing the audience wanted to see broken. BoyNextDoor did not just change the rookie game. They exposed the sustainability of honesty, setting a precedent that legacy acts will inevitably have to acknowledge. In an age of simulation, reality is the ultimate premium.